Father sold his pregnant fat daughter to Mountain Man as punishment, but what he did to her. The saloon in Dry Creek was thick with smoke, laughter, and the clink of cheap whiskey glasses when the doors slammed open. Ephraim Dunn staggered inside, his face red with fury and liquor. At his side, dragged by the arm, was his daughter, Mary Beth. Her cheeks were flushed with shame, her dress clung awkwardly to her rounded form, and beneath the fabric her pregnancy was plain for all to see. The room fell silent. Then Ephraim shouted, his words slurred but venomous. "This one's ruined, pregnant and without a husband. She shamed me, shamed this family. So I'll sell her to the highest bidder. Who'll take her off my hands?" Laughter and gasps rippled through the crowd. Men leaned back in their chairs, smirking, whispering cruel jokes about her size, her condition, her worth. Mary Beth lowered her eyes, tears slipping down her face as she held her stomach protectively. And then, from the shadowed corner of the saloon, a chair scraped back. A giant of a man rose. Luis Cutter, the Mountain Man. The townsfolk's smirks faltered. Cutter was spoken of in hushed tones, a figure of fear, solitude, and strength. Without a word, he walked to the bar and placed a single silver dollar on the counter. The sound of the coin hitting wood echoed louder than any shout. Gasps filled the saloon. Ephraim blinked, stunned. "That's all she's worth to you?" Luis didn't look at him. Instead, he turned to Mary Beth, removed the heavy coat from his shoulders, and draped it over her shaking form. His voice was low, steady, unshakable. "She's worth more than every man in this room combined." He guided her out of the saloon, leaving behind a silence so deep it burned with shame. The night air outside the saloon was cold, biting against Mary Beth's damp cheeks. She pulled the heavy coat tighter around her body, still trembling from the humiliation. The echoes of laughter and her father's voice seemed to follow her down the dusty street. She had never felt smaller, though she had always been mocked for her size. Mary Beth Dunn was 23, a woman who had once dreamed of sewing dresses and perhaps opening a small shop in Dry Creek. But her dreams had collapsed the day Thomas, the quiet railroad worker she had secretly married, was crushed in an accident before their vows could be recorded at the courthouse. His death left her carrying his child, alone in a town where whispers carried like wildfire. In the eyes of her father, her pregnancy was not proof of love, but a brand of shame. And tonight he had made her shame public property. Luis Cutter was nothing like the drunken cowhands and sly-eyed merchants who had jeered at her. As he led her down the street, his hand steady at her elbow, she dared to glance up at him. His face was weathered, lined by years of harsh mountain wind. Scars cut across his cheek and jaw. Old marks of battles survived. His silence was heavy, but it was not cruel. He stopped at the hitching post, where a broad-chested mule waited patiently. He lifted Mary Beth onto the animal as though she weighed no more than a child. She stammered, her voice breaking. Why would you take me?" Luis adjusted the reins, then met her eyes. "Because no one deserves to be left like that." His words were simple, but they struck deeper than any kindness she had known in months. The journey out of town was silent, except for the mule's hooves and the far-off cry of coyotes. Mary Beth held her belly, whispering a prayer that this strange man would not harm her. Every tale in Dry Creek had painted Luis Cutter as a savage, a widower who had once buried a wife and child up in the high country and never returned the same. Some said he killed without hesitation. Others claimed he had lost his tongue in battle, though she had already heard his deep voice prove them wrong. When they reached his cabin, a lonely structure of logs perched against the flank of the mountains, Mary Beth's breath caught. The place looked as though time had forgotten it. The roof sagged in places, the shutters hung crooked, and the yard was littered with unchopped wood. Yet there was something solid, enduring, about the home. Louise helped her down, then opened the door with a creak. The cabin smelled of smoke and pine resin. A single chair sat near the hearth, a rifle leaned against the wall, and a heavy quilt lay folded at the foot of a bed too wide for one man. "You'll be safe here," he said quietly, setting her small bag on the table. "No one will touch you while I live." For the first time since her father's betrayal, Mary Beth felt a flicker of relief. But fear still gnawed at her. Who was this man really? And why would he bother to protect a pregnant woman the whole town had cast aside? As she lowered herself into the chair, the firelight touched her face, and Louise Cutter studied her with an expression she could not yet read. She did not know it, but this was the moment two broken lives had begun to weave together in a cabin where grief, shame, and loneliness would slowly be transformed into something far stronger. Dawn broke pale and gray over the mountains, painting the world in muted shades of silver. Mary Beth awoke stiff and uneasy, the rough wool blanket heavy across her lap. For a moment she forgot where she was. Then the memory of her father's sneer and Louis Cutter's quiet intervention returned like a blow to the chest. Louis was already outside, the sound of his axe splitting wood echoing in the thin air. She rose slowly, her hand resting protectively over the swell of her stomach. The child shifted inside her, a reminder of why she could not afford to collapse under shame. When she stepped out onto the porch, the cold mountain wind stung her face. Louis glanced up, his scarred features unreadable. He nodded toward the trail that wound into the high country. "We need to ride into the pass today. I've got traps to check, and you should see what life out here means." Mary Beth hesitated. The thought of leaving the faint safety of the cabin unnerved her. Yet there was something steady in his voice, something that made it hard to refuse. She pulled his heavy coat tighter around her and followed him to the mule. The trail was unforgiving. Loose stones shifted underfoot, and the air grew thinner as they climbed. Louise rode ahead, guiding the mule with quiet authority. When they reached a shallow stream, Mary Beth nearly slipped as she stepped down to cross. Without a word, Louise extended his hand, calloused and strong. She placed her own trembling hand in his, expecting the grip of a brute. Instead, his touch was careful, almost reverent, as he steadied her across the rocks. By midday, they reached a clearing where the snow still clung to the shadows of towering pines. Louise built a small fire and handed her a tin cup of broth he had carried in a leather pouch. Steam curled upward, fragrant and rich. She took a cautious sip and felt warmth spread through her chest. For months, she had eaten little more than stale bread. This simple meal felt like a feast. "You'll need strength," he said, "for yourself, for the child." No man had spoken to her in such a way, not as a burden, not as a failure, but as someone worth protecting. Tears pricked at her eyes, and she turned her face toward the fire so he would not see. As they rested, Louis busied himself with his traps, bringing back 2 rabbits. He worked with quiet efficiency, skinning and preparing them without a hint of boastfulness. Mary Beth watched, fascinated. Town gossip had painted him as half wild, but here was a man who lived by his own skill, not cruelty. On the journey back, the sky turned quickly, as it often did in the mountains. Clouds thickened, and the first flakes of snow spiraled down. By the time they reached the ridge above the cabin, the world was a blur of white. The mule balked against the wind. Mary Beth, shivering despite the coat, felt her strength failing. Luis dismounted and walked beside her, one arm braced around her shoulders, shielding her from the gale. His voice, though rough, carried a steady calm. Almost there, just a little further. They stumbled into the cabin as night fell, snow swirling in behind them. Luis stoked the fire to life, the flames leaping and filling the room with warmth. He pulled another quilt from the chest and wrapped it around her, his hands lingering just long enough to make her heart pound with the strange, unfamiliar comfort. Mary Beth sat close to the hearth, her belly heavy, the child stirring within. For the first time in months, she felt not just safe, but seen. She dared to glance at Luis, who sat across the room mending a strap by firelight. His silence was no longer frightening. It was a fortress. Outside, the storm howled through the pines. Inside, the crackle of the fire and the steady rhythm of his hands at work made the small cabin feel like a sanctuary. In the stillness, Mary Beth realized that her journey had only just begun. Not the climb up the mountain, but the slow, fragile climb toward trust, dignity, and perhaps even love. The days settled into a rhythm, as steady as the swing of Luis's axe or the crackle of the fire. At first, Mary Beth felt like a guest, moving carefully through the small cabin, uncertain which tasks she might take on without overstepping. But soon, necessity pressed her into action. On her second morning, she found a broom leaning against the doorframe, its bristles worn but serviceable. She picked it up and began sweeping the rough plank floor, each stroke scattering months of dust into the cold air. Luis paused from stacking wood outside, watching through the window. He said nothing, but when he stepped inside and saw the room cleaner, a faint nod betrayed his approval. She started cooking with what she could find: beans, cornmeal, a slab of dried venison. The first pot was too salty, and she flushed with embarrassment, expecting his scorn. Instead, Luis ate quietly, then set his spoon down and said, "Better than what I've been eating." It was the closest thing to a compliment she had heard in years. Little by little, she reshaped the cabin. She patched a torn quilt with scraps from her own dress hem, scrubbed soot from the hearthstones, and aired out the bed linens that smelled of mildew. She found a cracked clay jug and filled it with pine boughs to give the table a fresh scent. Luis never commented on these small touches, but he noticed. His eyes lingered a little longer each evening, softening as he watched her stir a pot or hum a hymn while she worked. The chores were heavy, especially for a woman carrying life inside her. Chopping wood was beyond her strength, but Luis showed her how to split kindling with a hatchet, steadying her hands on the handle until she struck clean. "You'll need to know this," he told her, his voice low and steady, "if I'm away." When she faltered under the weight of the pail on the slope leading to the creek, he walked beside her, taking the handle before she could protest. She expected him to mock her weakness, as her father once did. Instead, he said, "The mountain doesn't bend easy, but neither do you." It was in the evenings that Mary Beth began to feel something deeper stirring. The wind would batter the shutters, wolves howling in the distance, but inside the fire painted the walls with gold. Luis would sit in his chair, knife in hand, shaping wood into small figures, a bird, a horse, once even a cradle. Mary Beth, wrapped in a quilt, would mend clothing or sing soft lullabies to the child within her. In those quiet hours words were scarce, but the silence between them was no longer hollow. It was full. One evening, after she had served him a stew thick with rabbit and wild onion, he pushed his bowl aside and cleared his throat. "I buried my wife and boy here. Fever took them quick." His eyes stayed fixed on the fire. "Since then, I didn't let anyone close. Thought it safer that way." Mary Beth's breath caught. It was the first time he had spoken of his past. She set down her sewing, unsure what to say. Finally, she whispered, "I lost my husband too, and now I've lost my father." She gave a short, bitter laugh. "Though he's still alive." Luis looked at her then, really looked, as if seeing the wounds beneath her flesh. The firelight caught the lines of his face, deepened by grief, but softened now by something almost like kinship. He reached across the table and laid his hand briefly over hers, rough palm against soft skin. He didn't need words. The gesture was enough. Winter deepened. Snow piled high against the door, and they spent long hours indoors. Mary Beth found comfort in routine, kneading bread, boiling broth, mending Luis's shirts that were frayed at the cuffs. One afternoon, she laughed aloud when he ducked through the door carrying a sack of flour, his shoulders dusted white like a baker's apron. The sound startled them both, but then he chuckled, a low, rusty sound, as if laughter had lain unused in his chest for years. The bond between them grew not through grand declarations, but through small, unspoken kindnesses. Luis always let her eat first. He warmed stones by the fire and tucked them into her bedding to keep her warm at night. He built a low stool so she could sit more easily as her belly grew. And when she once woke in the dark, crying from a dream of her father's scorn, she found Luis sitting silently near her bed, rifle across his knees, keeping watch until dawn. Mary Beth, who had once been broken by humiliation, began to stand straighter. Her voice grew steadier, her steps more sure. In the mirror of Luis's quiet respect, she discovered the dignity her father had tried to strip away, and in the warmth of the cabin, beneath the weight of the snow, two people once exiled by grief were slowly learning what it meant to build not just a shelter, but a home. By late January, the cabin had become more than a refuge. It was a place of fragile hope. But the mountains did not shield them from whispers that carried up from town. Trouble was stirring, and soon the peace Mary Beth had found would be tested. One evening, when Luis returned from trading pelts, his face was grim. He tossed a folded flyer onto the table. Mary Beth smoothed it open with trembling hands. Across the top in bold letters were the words, "Sheriff Tanner, to enforce guardianship rights of Ephraim Dunn." Below, the notice declared that Ephraim Dunn intended to claim custody of his unborn grandchild for the sake of propriety and lawful inheritance. Mary Beth's blood ran cold. "Guardianship rights," she whispered. Luis's jaw tightened. "It means he'll try to take the child, and by law, the sheriff will stand with him if he can twist the papers to his favor." The next morning, Henry, their Ute neighbor, rode up with his wife Sarah. They brought dried herbs for Mary Beth's swelling ankles, but also heavy news. Henry had overheard railroad men speaking in town. They mentioned Ephraim by name. The company sought control of a string of valleys where Thomas, Mary Beth's late husband, had filed preliminary homestead claims. Those claims, if validated, would belong to Mary Beth's child. Ephraim was their willing accomplice. His cruelty in the saloon had not been a father's rage, but a calculated move to disown her, then seize legal control of the land once the baby arrived. Mary Beth sat in stunned silence, her hands pressed protectively over her belly. All this time she had believed her father's betrayal was born of shame, but the truth was worse: greed. He had turned her life into a commodity, her child into a pawn. Luis's eyes burned with quiet fury. So that's why he tried to cast you aside. He wants the land, not you, not the child, only what he can take through you. Henry laid a hand on Luis's shoulder. The railroad has bought the sheriff, but they haven't bought the law. If you two are bound in marriage, no man can touch the child without your consent. Mary Beth looked up sharply. Marriage? It was Sarah who spoke, her voice gentle but firm. A covenant before God and law. It will shield you both. Without it, Ephraim will claim you unfit and snatch the child the moment it's born. The idea rattled Mary Beth. She had come to trust Luis, even to lean on him. But marriage? She glanced at him, searching his scarred face for a hint of his feelings. He returned her gaze steadily. Better papers to protect you, he said softly, but it doesn't have to mean more than you want. Her heart twisted. Did she want more? Each quiet kindness, each steady look had already begun to stir feelings she had buried under shame. She nodded. Yes, for the child. 2 days later, Reverend Johnson, the circuit preacher, made his way up the trail through the snow. He carried nothing more than a worn Bible and a voice hoarse from winter winds. In the dim cabin, with Henry and Sarah as witnesses, Luis and Mary Beth stood side by side. The ceremony was brief, but when Luis spoke the words, "to protect and to keep," his voice caught on the edge of something raw. Mary Beth's hands trembled in his, not from fear, but from the strange weight of hope. When the Reverend declared them husband and wife, Luis bent and pressed a reverent kiss to her forehead. It was not passion, not yet, but it was promise. That night, as the snowstorm raged outside, Mary Beth lay awake listening to the steady rhythm of Luis's breath in the next room. The papers were signed, the vows spoken, but it was not legality that kept her safe. It was him. Still, a shadow lingered. Down in town, Ephraim Dunn was gathering his allies. The sheriff, already bought and paid for, had sworn to bring Luis Cutter down. And the railroad men, men with maps, ledgers, and guns, had no intention of letting a grieving daughter or a reclusive mountain man stand in their way. The mountain cabin, once only a shelter, was now a fortress standing against greed, lawlessness, and a father's betrayal. And both Luis and Mary Beth knew the storm was only beginning. The storm broke not with thunder, but with hooves. Near midnight, the sharp echo of riders cut through the valley. Luis rose from his cot, rifle already in hand. Mary Beth, heavy with child, pressed herself against the doorframe, her face pale in the lamplight. Outside, voices barked. Sheriff Tanner, his badge glinting, called out, "Luis Cutter, by order of the law, you've kidnapped Miss Dunn. Open the door, or we'll drag her out ourselves." Mary Beth's breath quickened. Luis placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "You stay behind me," he whispered. Then, louder, he answered, "She is my wife. You've no right to her, nor to our child." A cruel laugh rang out. Ephraim Dunn urged his horse closer to the porch. "You think marriage vows spoken in some shack mean a thing? That girl is mine to claim, and the babe in her belly belongs to me. Stand aside, Cutter." Luis stepped onto the porch, rifle in plain sight. The snow swirled around him, his broad frame a wall of defiance. "You disowned her in front of half the town. You sold her like cattle. You have no claim here. Leave before you force me to prove it." The sheriff raised his hand. Deputies began to fan out, torches in hand. One tossed a flaming brand into the snow near the cabin's wall. Luis's voice dropped to a dangerous growl. "Try to burn this house, and I'll put you in the ground." The moment teetered on the edge of bloodshed. Then the crunch of more hooves split the night. Out of the darkness rode Henry, Pastor Elliott, and a dozen townsfolk, ranchers, farmers, men who had once kept silent. They carried lanterns and hunting rifles, their faces grim. Pastor Elliott rode forward, his old Bible held high. "Sheriff, you know this marriage is lawful. You know the Reverend witnessed it, and I have seen the land papers with my own eyes. This charade ends tonight." Ephraim's face twisted with rage. "You'll all regret this. That land belongs to the railroad and to me through my bloodline." Mary Beth's voice rang out from the doorway, trembling but fierce. "No, Father. You lost your bloodline the day you sold your daughter for silver. My child will never bear your name." For the first time, Ephraim faltered. The deputies, seeing the townspeople's rifles aimed squarely at them, lowered their own weapons. Sheriff Tanner's bravado crumbled. He muttered a curse and holstered his pistol. Luis leveled his rifle, then slowly lowered it. "Take him out of here," he said flatly, "and don't come back." No shots were fired that night. The Dunn name, once feared, was left in the snow, disgraced and hollow. The riders turned back toward town, carrying Ephraim's curses with them. Inside the cabin, Luis shut the door against the cold. Mary Beth leaned into him, shaking from more than fear. He wrapped her in his arms, whispering, "You're safe here, both of you." And though danger might rise again, for the first time, Mary Beth believed it. She and her child were truly safe. The cabin glowed like a lantern in the winter dark. The fire snapped and hissed, casting long shadows against the rough-hewn walls. Mary Beth sat in the rocker near the hearth. The quilt pulled around her shoulders. Her hands rested protectively on the swell of her belly, still trembling from the night's terror. Luis crouched by the fire, stirring the coals back to life. For a long while, neither spoke. The weight of what had happened still hung in the room like smoke. Finally, Mary Beth's voice broke the silence. "I thought I'd never be more than a burden, that my father was right. That shame was all I had to carry." Her eyes glistened in the firelight. "But tonight, I saw men stand for me. I saw you stand for me. And for the first time, I believe I can belong." Luis turned toward her, his rugged face softened by the glow. He reached out, hesitant at first, then firm, taking her hand in his. "You're not a burden," he said quietly. "You're the reason this house is alive again. You and the child you carry." His thumb brushed over her knuckles. "If you'll stay, this will always be your home." A tear slipped down Mary Beth's cheek, but her smile trembled through it. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead against his. "Then I'll stay, for as long as you'll have me." The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, the snow whispered against the window, soft and steady, as if sealing the vow spoken within. They sat together in the silence, two souls battered by the world, yet bound now by choice, not circumstance. And though danger lurked beyond the mountains, one question lingered in the stillness. Would the love they had found be strong enough to withstand whatever storm waited just beyond the horizon? Every time I share stories like this, I'm reminded of how deeply love and courage can connect us across time and distance. Mary Beth and Luis's journey is not just about survival. It's about discovering that even in the harshest places, hearts can find their home. Now I'd love to hear from you. Where in the world are you listening from? Do you believe that love born out of hardship can grow stronger than any storm? If you still believe in love, don't go anywhere. The next story is waiting just for you.